Hey everyone, it's Emily Fox. Today's video is going to be the continuation of this new series where I am talking about my all-time favorite books. And every year in the last couple of years, I've been trying to find a #1 best book of the year, and then I spend the next year talking about it until I force all of you to read it. And I thought it was a little sad that I didn't have all-time favorites for the past years when I first started Booktube, so we're going back and doing just that. So for today's video, we're going back to 2017, which is my first full year on Booktube. I finished, according to Goodreads, 116 books, which is absolutely insane. It is one of my best year in terms of the amount of books that I did finish. And you can see the overall rating was fairly good. You can see the bell curve is definitely leaning towards the 4-star. In 2017, I turned a corner and started accepting that just because a book was popular, it wasn't necessarily going to work for me. I was still definitely reading the popular books, not necessarily the books that appealed to me the most. I was still trying to figure out what worked for me, which is completely normal. So for this video, I will be going through month by month all of the books that I've read and choosing a favorite per month, and then ultimately finding my #1 best book of that year. Obviously, I will be looking at these through a 2024 lens, which I think makes it a bit more interesting because maybe some of them I still absolutely love 7 years later. Some of them I might be a little bit more critical and a bit more comfortable telling you that they weren't necessarily working for me, or I don't think they would work as well for me. But it also gives you the opportunity to hear my thoughts on these again. Some of these I haven't talked about since in like 7 years, and some of these you'll notice that I'm still talking about them. So let's get to work. In January of 2017, I finished 13 books, which is insane. To be fair, a lot of these were on the shorter side, but still, it's a good amount. So in order. Every Heart a Doorway is a YA fantasy series that follows young children who went to alternative world, think Narnia, and then whenever they come back to their world, they are struggling to adapt, so they are sent to this house for wayward children, and you're following them, you know, dealing with the trauma, really. And in this one specifically, there's a bit of a murder mystery happening. I have read a lot of books in this series, and I would say book 1 is probably my second favorite, so I do think it's a good beginning to this series. So I did overall enjoy this. Then I finished The Handmaid's Tale, which I feel like in the moment, it was one of the first books that I realized that I didn't like as much as everyone else. I feel like there's a lot of pressure sometimes to love those books. And this is a dystopian. I mean, I feel like everyone knows about this one because of a TV show. But quite frankly, I found it kind of boring. At the time, I think I rounded it down to 3 stars, which was, you know, a big deal for me. But I found it kind of boring, and I feel like from a 2024 lens, I have heard a lot more critiques about this book, and the author did take inspiration from actual real-life event. That's what makes it so horrifying, the fact that it's actually all true. It all happened at one point or another in history. But the thing is, I've heard a lot of people mention that it's actually things that have happened to women of color, and white women reading this book are feeling awful about it because it's like slavery for white people. So I'm trying to keep these reviews really quick, but that kind of gives you the gist of it, and I do think that there are a lot of valid points in there. So not a favorite. I did read book 2 eventually, and I didn't care for it, so there's that. Next, we have The Thief, which is is it adult fantasy series? I forgot about this, honestly. It was very unmemorable. At the time, it was popular, and I haven't heard about it since, and I haven't really thought about it. I read book 2 eventually, but again, gave up on the series after, so forgettable. The Tale of Two Cities is one of the most awful thing I have ever heard. Specifically, this is the comic book. I have not read the full-length novel, and I thought this could be fun because these classics can be a bit intimidating, and I thought that will give me an idea of what the story is about. That way I can eventually get to the classic, and I still don't know what the classic is about. It was like 100 pages long, and one of the worst things I've ever read. I have no idea. I finished it because I used to just never give up on books, and I understood nothing. Don't read this. Even on Goodreads, the rating is like 2 point something, which like you never see anything with a 2, so awful. Binti didn't stick with me as much as I thought it would. Is it considered sci-fi fantasy, kind of a mix? The magic / superpowers are linked to maths, which I thought was interesting, but again, the story didn't really stick with me as much as I thought it would. Thanks for the Trouble. I don't think I've talked about this since 2017, but I was kind of feeling a bit slumpy-ish, and I feel like I read this really quickly. This definitely contains the trope of like manic pixie dream girl, and it was still okay. At the time, I gave it 4-star, and again, I haven't talked about it or thought about it since, so I then finished Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which I also found underwhelming. I was really trying to find favorites. I eventually did, but January was not a great month for me that year. Dystopian sci-fi, I feel like it's a classic, but I once again found it kind of boring. I feel the same about the movies, to be honest. The Gunslinger by Stephen King, I hated this. This was also one of the first time I finally admitted that I hated something that was popular. I got a lot of backlash since, and honestly, I've accepted it. A lot of you have also started feeling okay admitting that you hate it. I didn't understand much of it, and what I did understand, I didn't care for it. It's unpopular, but I hated this. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a classic. It's enjoyable. I do feel like it was almost long. I felt like I would have enjoyed more as a short story, which seems to be, again, the unpopular opinion, but I enjoyed the overall idea of it. Although I'm nervous about the adaptation that is coming out, where two male characters are brothers. Please, they're not. Ugh. Anyway, they were roommates, apparently. Then, finally, one book I loved. The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. This is the ending to the first Mistborn trilogy. And my mind was completely blown. I feel like people feel differently about some portion of the book, especially like the religion portion, which I agree. But at the time, I wasn't expecting how every piece falls into place. And you realize, oh, the author thought about everything. Like the world building, the magic system, the religion, political, like everything was there for a reason. And I'm still not over it. I still think this is a fantastic series. I don't think it's the best way to start, which I feel like everyone is always debating that, but I loved it. I loved it. So this is the best book of January, and I'm not even done, but easily the best book. Then we have Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, which at the time was extremely popular. This is a contemporary YA. And I think it's a duology. I've only read the first book, and I felt a bit indifferent. It was so popular, and everyone loved it, and I thought it was just okay. I liked the family more than anything else, more than the romance, I guess, but it was okay. I feel like I haven't heard anyone mention this in a while. I did continue my reread of Harry Potter. Then I read The Giver, which I wanted to reread this because I read it in English in high school, and I didn't speak English in high school. So I understood absolutely nothing. So I reread it as an adult, finally bilingual, and I did enjoy it, but it wasn't as mind-blowing as I expected it. But I feel like it's more of a YA story, middle grade, maybe. It's a quick read, though. I enjoyed the overall idea, but I found the ending really unsatisfying. I know it became a series later on, but whatever. So for a long, difficult January, my best book of that month has to be The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, obviously. This was so epic. If you haven't read this series, it is something. So for February, I finished 12 books. And you know how the intro was mentioning I was reading the popular books and it was a struggle? This is what February was for me. But I feel like nowadays, I appreciate that I tried it and made me realize that I needed to look elsewhere and not necessarily believe that everyone's favorite book was going to be my favorite book. So it's okay. And I'm normalizing, not loving everything that is popular. So in February, the first book I finished was My Lady Jane, which the TV show just happened finally this year, and the TV show was by far better than the book. I'm just gonna say it. It's like, why fantasy? And the authors are reusing really popular Janes in history and changing the story and making it a lot more fun because her story is really tragic. So if you're looking at it, I would say just watch the TV show, even though they've canceled season 2, which is insane. Hopefully it'll change their mind, but it was just okay. Uprooted was a big flop for me. I couldn't finish it actually because people sometimes they'll give you a summary of the plot and you realize it's not. In this one, there's this village where every year a dragon comes and, steals a young woman to bring to his tower, which is what I expected the book to be about, but turns out the dragon is a man. So, changes the story completely. And he brings her in to, teach her magic, which should be something I love, and I hated it. There seemed to be, a beginning of a romance. I'm assuming it's going to happen. Again, I didn't finish the book, so it can't be a spoiler. And I thought it felt really abusive. I hated him, and I hated the magic system. It felt very vague, and no. A Wizard Heartsea. Super popular YA fantasy series. I barely finished that book. I didn't care for it. Then I read some Harry Potter stuff. And then I read Steelheart because I was really excited to read more Brandon Sanderson. And I have since realized that his YA stuff doesn't work for me as well. But this is YA sci-fi. And instead of following superheroes, you're following supervillains, which does tend to work better though. My issue was not the magic system because it was super interesting. Basically, people develop these superpowers and again, they become supervillains instead of superheroes. And you follow a main character who doesn't have power. He's just trying to survive through all of it. But my issue was it's a teenage boy and is teenagers, they read super, super young. And I don't know if it's because the author is Mormon, but like also the romance was awful. But if you focus just on the magical or like fantasy sci-fi elements, it's popular. I have yet to continue the series, so there's that. Attachments by Rainbow Rowell. I attempted to give a second chance to the author, and this read like a horror book. Okay, I'm sorry. People were saying this is a contemporary romance. This is pure horror. This is a story of a man who stalks a woman. Like, there's nothing romantic. He works in IT, and he's reading her emails with her friend, and he's just falling in love with her over that, and then starts stalking her because he's in love. And like, I'm still questioning everyone's sanity because how is that romantic? And there's the whole fact that like you think he's a loser at first because you're told that like, oh, his mom makes his lunches, blah blah blah, and turns out like he's highly educated, tall and hot. It's creepy. It's creepy. So no. The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I thought this was going to be about two magicians in competition, which is what you hear what the story's about, but it's just vibes. Nothing happens. It's just beautiful writing, which is what the author in general does. So it either works for you, it doesn't. I did overall still enjoy myself reading it. I don't know how I would feel about it nowadays, but The Rose and the Dagger is also where I started realizing maybe why it wasn't for me, because this is a YA fantasy romance where this young prince takes new wives and murders them constantly, and then the main female character, you know, goes there to, I think one of her family members was one of those women, young girls, I should say. And I think a romance like that is stupid. Like, why would you ever forgive a man who's murdering a bunch of women? And the explanation, stupid, stupid. So again, is it because you're reading them as an adult and you're looking at this and like, I don't know, to me, like, it's not forgivable. So like, whatever, I can't suspend my disbelief, clearly. Denes was so incredibly forgettable that I've mostly forgotten what it was about. I know it's an adult contemporary, and I think it's like, is it the parents passing away and dealing with the grief? Don't remember. And then I finished A Court of Thorns and Roses, which I will never get over the fact that people are still loving and reading Sarah J. Maas, because why? I know her books are very readable. That I get, but this was just not great. At the time, I compared it to like Katniss Everdeen that just doesn't know how to do anything, really. The romance was incredibly ridiculous. I hated it. I did continue the series, and book 2 I feel like made that a lot better, but every time I hear someone reading book 1, which that has happened in real life, and when one of those girls would tell me, oh, I love the romance, I would reevaluate how I feel about that person. And I don't mean this meanly, I know it sounds mean, but like, are you serious? It makes you feel like you're going to have to make sure she's okay in future relationships, because this is not normal. But yeah, I gave it 2-star. Didn't care for it. So I have no idea what to tell you was my best book of that month, because everything sucked. Which is why later on I'm finding favorites, because I'm giving up on the popular books because clearly they're not working for me. But if I had to choose, like, the only books I gave 3 stars to were My Lady Jane and Still. So, I'm not counting the Harry Potter stuff, so it has to be one of those two. So I'm gonna give it to Steelheart, even though I hated it. I didn't hate it. Again, the superpowers were really interesting. The ending was great, as always, with Sanderson, but I cringed a lot reading it. So let's just move on, because February was not a good month. March is where I finally start finding some favorites, finally. So let's talk about the 9 books I have finished plus 1. I'm saying that because the first book I'm seeing is The Heart of Betrayal, which is book 2 in the Kiss of Deception series, which for some reason book 1 disappeared from my read list. Goodreads does that sometimes. I don't know why. I'm just going to talk about the whole trilogy in one go. So this one changed my mind about some YA fantasy romance, because I kept being tricked. I felt like reading some fantasy that turned out to be mostly romance, and this one I ended up really enjoying. I don't know how I would feel about it nowadays, though, but I did give the whole series 5 stars, so at the time, I loved it. You follow this princess who she is supposed to marry this prince she's never met. She doesn't want to, so she escapes. And 2 men go after her. There is the prince she was supposed to marry, and then an assassin sent to kill her. And throughout the book, you don't know who is who. So you follow the narration in book 1, that's what's going on. And then book 2 and 3, the world becomes bigger. It becomes a lot more political intrigue. And I remember just really enjoying it, even though there's a love triangle, which can be more hit and miss for me. But this one, at the time, I really liked it. So cool. If you've read this recently, let me know how you felt, because I don't know how I would feel about it in 2024. Next, we have Conjuring of Light by V. Schwab. I really like this series overall. I do think book 3 was the weakest one. I still think the magic system, the world building is really interesting, but I felt like some of the characters, especially the main female character, Lila, I'm pretty sure it's Lila, she became a caricature of herself. And like, I feel like all her character's growth just went out the window, which was kind of disappointing. And I did feel like you were following too many point of views, but I still overall really enjoy this. The author actually just recently came out with like companion novels, and I've read book 1. I've enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to continuing. So like book 3 was just not my favorite in general, but I do think the series is worth checking out. Oh, it's adult fantasy too. Then I started my love affair with people reliving their lives or their days over and over again. I read so many of these, but the first one was The First 15 Lives of Harry August. This one is a little strange. I feel like the author in general tends to write almost literally fiction sci-fi fantasy books, which is not something you see super often. So the writing was not the easiest for me to go through because English is my second language, but the premise was right up my alley. So you're following Harry August. He has lived at least 15 times, and you're following him in his brain. The narration is affected by it. So I feel like you do get some back and forth between the timelines, his life that he has lived. So it can be a little overwhelming as you're going through it. But overall, as he's dying for the 15th time, there's someone that shows up and tells him that someone is playing with the timelines and he has to try and fix it, kind of thing. So you're following this. It's almost like a bit spy novels at some points, so you may or may not like it, but I thought it was a really interesting premise, definitely worth checking out if that's something that sounds appealing to you, but just be ready for the type of narration. I then read 2 short stories. First one was Snapshot by Brandon Sanderson. I can't even tell you what it was about. I know it's like a detective kind of thing, but like it was just okay. And then Mitosis, which is the short story between book 1 and 2 of After Steelheart. And like I said, I haven't read book 2 yet, so 7 years later. We're just going to move on because the next book I did love, and it is The Long Way to Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This was the first book I read by her. She writes mostly really wholesome sci-fi, which I feel like that's not something you see super often. More nowadays, I feel like, but she was like my first, and this is so fun and just wholesome. And after all the bad books I had started the year with, this was very much welcome. This was a 5-star. You're following this group of aliens and humans that are in spaceship. They have to go through some kind of challenge. You make some friends, you have some giggles, you do have some tears possibly towards the end, and it was just such a feel-good story. I believe there are 4 books in this series now, and I have read all 4, so I will continue to read anything and everything by her. I then read some nonfiction. I finished Brain on Fire, which is the main character who is struggling to get a diagnosis, which, shocking, but this was interesting, although kind of horrifying. And then I read We Should All Be Feminists, which was technically a TED Talk, and the author made it into a novel. This is definitely a must-read. It's extremely short. And then I read 1984, which you're going to notice I'm still feeling the pressure to read, the classics. You want to know, to be fair. Like, when everyone is always talking about a book, you want to know what you're going to feel about it. But this one was just okay. It's one of those that I feel like the message is interesting, but I'm not enjoying myself as I'm reading it. Yeah. So my favorite for the month of March, I think I'm going to give it to The Long Way to Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. It's just such a feel-good book. I want to reread it eventually. In April, I finished 12 books again. The first one was Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is an adult fantasy currently standalone, although the author is planning on extending it. I think this one is going to be a trilogy. This one is so complicated to explain, but it was so good. I think it's one of his first novel too, so I feel like you see some weaknesses, but overall it's still a 5-star. Essentially, in that world, people could wake up one day and be like fully gray, and you're just blessed, and you go to Elantris, this magical city where you don't die, you don't get sick, you don't get hungry, and it's just perfect. But then something happened, they don't really know why, and that stops. When you turn gray, you are cursed, so you are just always starving, you're always sickly, and you're sent there, to be hidden away. And you're following 2 point of views, mainly this princess that is sent to marry the prince next to the city. But then by the time she arrives there, the prince actually woke up cursed and is sent hidden away to this city, so she's kind of dealing with whatever is left, and you're following what's happening. And there's a lot more to it, but just overall, it was fantastic. You need to read this. Then I read some more Harry Potter stuff. Then I picked up Illuminae, which was a YA sci-fi that was so popular at the time. To be fair, I do think the format is really interesting because a lot of it is told in like emails and just different, like it's very visual, so I would highly recommend you read it as a physical book or ebook. I get just not the audiobook because I tried that with book 2 and it was awful. But like reading the date in like every email address, don't do it. But I thought it was just okay. I feel like it was super popular, and It was fine. I don't think I've talked about it since. Then I read Fahrenheit 451 because that's another book that I had to read in high school in English. And this one I understood nothing. And I mean nothing when I read it. So I wanted to see, now that I'm bilingual, I do think that was still hard. Obviously I understood everything now, but it was still not the easiest book to go through. And like 1984, I feel like it's the kind of book that the message is great, the execution, I kind of found a little boring, a little underwhelming, basically. Then I read Jane Eyre, which I think I found it a little bit underwhelming. I still overall gave it 4 stars. It was still a solid read. I liked Jane. I liked the first half of the book, but I went into it expecting a romance because everyone says, you know, oh, it's so romantic. No, that also makes me question everyone. Are you guys okay? Because like Mr. Rochester is an awful person. I don't care about no, there's no redeemables. No. But Jane was great, so I still think this is a classic that is worth reading, but really? You find that romantic? Oh well. Next I read I Am Legend, and this makes so much more sense than the movie. I had enjoyed the movie, but I feel like it doesn't explain the actual title, I Am Legend. And in the book, it's quite a short book too, you finally get the explanation. I can spoil it in the comment section if you want me to, but I overall enjoyed it. I did find it a little bit like sexually violent at times, but this was overall better in terms of the title making sense. The ending was good, basically. Truth Witch, it's been that long. I've been meaning to continue this. This is a YA fantasy series where people have very unique magical powers. So for example, one of them can see like the links between people and can kind of play with it. It's just interesting, and I don't know why I never continued. I even have it on my shelf and I've been meaning to and I just haven't. So I did really enjoy it at the time. Then I read 2 nonfiction from the same author back to back. We have Let's Pretend This Never Happened and Furiously Happy, which I like Furiously Happy a little bit more. I highly recommend listening to those as audiobooks because the author is narrating them and she's just really funny. She just talks about her life and how she's dealing with mostly like mental health issues, and it's just really funny. It makes you feel better about life. So this was good. I then read Saga, which I wanted to give comic book another chance, and it was overall good. I just never continued. I don't think they're really for me, to be honest, but if you enjoy them, you've probably heard of them, but they are worth reading if you are a sci-fi lover. And then I read Modern Romance, which let's just move on. So for my best book of April of 2017, I think I'm going to have to give it to Elantris. I feel like Brandon Sanderson is going to win a lot of awards that year, but it was great. I feel like his endings are so good, you can't help but like them. In May, I finished 10 books, and we start with Replay, which I feel like is underrated. I have definitely mentioned this book quite a few times because, again, I do think it's underrated, and we're continuing with my big love of people reliving their lives over and over again. This one has a little twist to it. I don't want to spoil it. I mean, I can always do that in the comment section, but it made it really interesting and it felt realistic. I feel like often authors will start adding a lot more like fantasy or sci-fi elements, and this one didn't really. And the character was acting in a way that felt a bit more realistic than like other ones. So basically this man, I think he's in his 40s, he's on the phone when he has a heart attack, and then he wakes up in like 18-year-old body and he's like reliving his life. I don't want to say much more, but it was interesting. Would recommend it. I do feel like eventually it becomes a bit more like philosophical, kind of deeper messages, but it was great. Not enough people have read that one. Schizo is one of those books I have not thought about since I have read it, and I could not tell you what it was about. So then Vampire Academy. I was still trying to read the popular books. This one had been popular for years, and I wanted to try and see what the hype was about. And I was actually surprised. At the time, enjoyed it a lot more than I expected. It wasn't an all-time favorite. I think I gave it 4 stars. I don't know how I would feel about it nowadays, but it took me by surprise and I overall enjoyed it. I never continued, but it satisfied my craving of like finding out what people were raving about. So then we have Big Little Lies, which was my first book by the author, and looking back, the only one I've really enjoyed. But it was great. That was a 5-star. You're following a bunch of moms and there's a murder mystery, and I really enjoyed it. There's a TV show now that is quite popular. I've only seen the first season, but this was great. 5-star too. World War Z was shockingly not a favorite for me. I expected to love it because I had watched the movie and really enjoyed it. But this one was a lot heavier on military, which I am not a fan of. I've accepted that at this point, but at the time I didn't know. It's super popular though, so if that sounds appealing to you, I would pick it up. But zombies, apocalypse, which is my jam, but not military. Then we have The Beauty of Darkness, which is the 3rd book in that series about the 2 men running after the princess that I mentioned. Love that. And then I had what I called my sick weekend. I have been mentioning that weekend a few times, and it's when I binge read the Selection trilogy. I was sick in bed, I was really bored, and I wanted something extremely readable. And this was it. Was it good? No. Did I read the whole trilogy? Absolutely. I couldn't put it down. It's like junk food. Like, you just stuffing your face with it, and you don't necessarily feel good about yourself. It doesn't make you feel anything but nausea, but you can't stop. And it did what it needed to do. I also wanted to see what the hype was about. I get it now. It's like a contest where this girl goes and tries to get married with the prince, which a bunch of other girls. It's almost like TV reality in a fantasy world, and it's YA fantasy. And listen, it's super readable. So I can't even complain about this series because, like I said, I read the whole trilogy. So it happened. It happened. You know what? I'm not even mad about it because readability, when you need it, it's great. So, and then I read I, Robot, which is a collection of short stories, which I still feel like the movie was better. But I've been really trying to read more classic sci-fi. I used to really love doing that because I like seeing how, the genre started. But I feel like a lot of them have not aged super well. So for my best book of that month, I feel like at the time I would have given it to Big Little Lies, but I feel like looking back, I've raved more about Replay. It's been 7 years though, so I don't know if everything has aged well. I feel like that's the one thing about recommending books you've read years ago. I feel like I've become more critical over time, but without having reread it, this I think would be now my best book of that month. I'm going to try to go faster because holy. In June, I also finished 10 books. The first one is an adult sci-fi series that is quite popular if you like adult sci-fi, and it is We Are Legion, We Are Bob. Personally, I've only read the first book, and I listened to it as an audiobook, which frankly I think is the only way I finished it. I feel like funny books, it will be hit and miss, and I thought this book was just a little underwhelming. I feel like whenever you see a lot of people say, it's amazing, you're excited, and then you're like, oh, for me it was just okay. Like, no hard feelings, but long story short, because it's kind of complicated, you have this man who passes away and his brain becomes AI, and he's in a spaceship, and things happen. It was just okay for me. Continued reading Harry Potter, and then I read the classic because I was trying. This is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Super, super short and really different from the movie, which was great. But I feel like this one is really different because in the movie, Benjamin Button is born old, but like as a baby, and it's not quite like that in the book. I don't want to spoil it because it's super short, but it was different. But yeah, the movie was better. Simon versus the Homo sapien Agenda. That's another YA contemporary romance with gay characters, which were all the hype in 2017. I've read a lot of them. I feel like you would see gay characters a lot more than lesbians, which I still feel like there's a bias, which we won't go into details because I've had to block people in the past over this topic, but that one was super popular. At the time, I did enjoy it. I've since heard some critiques over this series, but I did overall like it. We Were Liars was super popular as a YA murder mystery, and at the time, I felt it was pretty underwhelming. We Are the Ants. At the time, I loved it, and I don't know how I'd feel about it nowadays, but the main character is depressed, and they think that if they don't do certain things, the world is going to end, like through aliens. So this is another YA contemporary sci-fi, so at the time, I liked it. Red Queen was another of those YA dystopians that were all over the place. I feel like people were hitting a little bit on it by the time I got to it, but I overall enjoyed it. So if you like those whole, it's just the classic tropes, really, like people that are oppressed and characters having powers, rebellion. I enjoyed it. It was fun for what it was. Hate U Give was also super popular at the time, YA contemporary. I overall liked it. A Man Called Uvar, which a thing for older men who become more friendly. They're grumpy at first, become more friendly over time. I don't think the main character in this one is super old, but it's just overall a classic trope, and I did overall enjoy it. And then you have Weekend Gods, which once again, I think Goodreads deleted one of the books that I finished because this is book 2. The first one is Sleeping Giants, which is an adult sci-fi series which contains aliens or giant robots. And I really liked book 1. I was really excited. It's kind of short. It's 200 pages, but it's told in a lot of interviews. So it goes really fast and you can listen to it as an audiobook if you want to, which is what I did with book 2, which was a mistake, quite frankly, because of the narration. There's a character who is the daughter of another character, and the voice is so annoying. I need to find a video where I included an excerpt, but
I got the water part right. We're definitely in the ocean.
I can't see anything.
You're a little freaked out, aren't you?
Can't you get us out of here?
Basically, it sounds like bad corn. It was just really, really awful. So book 1 was good, book 2 was and book 3 was not good. So it kind of goes there, but if you're interested in giant robot kind of story, you could give it a shot. So the best book that I read that month would have to go with We Are the Ants, which I haven't talked about since, but I remember really enjoyed it at the time. In June, I somehow finished 15 books. Wow. A lot of them are YA, and it's also when I really started discovering audiobooks, so I feel that helped me increase the amount, but it was once again a little hit and miss, some really strong favorites and some big flops. You Will Know Me is an adult mystery, and frankly, I was really annoyed when I listened to that one as an audiobook because I feel like sometimes mysteries are labeled as mysteries, but they're more drama, like family drama, and that's kind of what this one was about. It was super underwhelming. Down Among the Sticks and Bones, which is book 2 in that series with the children, where we're children going to different universe, it was just okay. I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. The Upside of Unrequited, which I haven't thought about since, to be honest. It's a YA contemporary romance. Main character has a lot of feelings for people and never tells them, and yeah, I don't really remember reading it, so that didn't stick. When Dimple Met Rishi, that is one of the first time that I got really angry reading a book because it's another YA contemporary romance, which I was really annoyed because it starts interesting. The main female character is Indian. She has a lot of pressure to, get married and stuff. And she decides that she wants to develop an app, and she manages to go through this competition where she, could get this opportunity. And then there is arranged romance boy, keeping it vague. And it becomes less about the app and more about a dancing competition. Like, it just bit and switch a little bit. And the romance was really toxic. She was really mean to Rishi. Like, she kept hitting him. Anyway, I was not a fan. Hacking from Mars is an interesting nonfiction about space. I would recommend it if you're intrigued. Next, I read The Black Prism, which is a YA, I know it's labeled adult, but YA fantasy series, which I was super excited about. Everyone I had seen talk about this book had given it 5-star. I was super excited because it was a magical school setting, which big fan. And the magic system was really intriguing. It was based on colors. So people that can see colors can use, those magical powers specifically. And I was ready to give it 5-star. And first off, it takes forever to really start, like 100 pages. And then I started becoming more and more annoyed about the misogyny, which is, again, I think this is the first book I started really mentioning it. And I got really annoyed that nobody had warned me. And it's not like subtle whatsoever. Like, I'm thinking the teenage character is talking about the breast of every female character. And during this big battle, the female character unfortunately is stuck in this dress that rips up to her butt. And she basically gets motorboated by the teenage boy. Just really awful things that I'm shocked nobody was calling out. And the humor felt extremely juvenile. At one point, that teenage boy during that big battle falls on his back and he thinks to himself, oh, I seem to be spending more time on my back than a whore. I felt like I wasn't the target audience, and that's why I was saying adult is questionable. It's definitely, the target audience was teenage boy, really. And I've gotten so much hate on Goodreads every time I mention this book and not liking it. I was extremely clear. I put so many quotes because I knew people were going to be like that, and they were. And yeah, it was really annoying. It took me 4 or 5 years to continue this series because I was so annoyed, but I thought I was going to love it. I felt like maybe the mystery was going to be good. I've since been spoiled the ending, which I won't in the video, I can in the comment section, but I was super annoyed about the ending too. So yeah, that was a huge disappointment. At the time I gave it 3-star because I was being nice, but I've since become a lot less patient about that stuff. And then there were None by Agatha Christie. This is a classic, one-room murder mystery. It has to be one of those people on the island that is murdering everyone. I thought the execution was fine, but for some reason her writing is really difficult for me. I don't know if it is because, again, it's my second language, but I felt it was just okay, which is, again, unpopular. I've been told to try them as audiobooks, so I might try to do that. Maybe it's going to make it easier for me, but it was okay. I think The Wanderers, sci-fi, is kind of a stretch. It's more, again, kind of drama. You're following characters that are meant to go in space, and nothing happens in that book, so I haven't talked about it since. Artemis by Andy Weir. I think this was one of the first ARC advanced reader copies I've ever received. I was so excited because I love The Martian. That was a 5-star for me. And this was his newest release where you're following, once again, a character that is supposed to survive with their wit in space, which is something I really enjoy. Unfortunately, you're following a female character and she's the same character as The Martian, but in a female body, and it read extremely bad. Once again, felt kind of sexist at times. The whole line about, the whole storyline about the condoms was stupid. Again, I'm just gonna say it. And there were a few things that were kind of racist vibes, so it was not good. I don't think anyone really loves this book. It's by far his worst one. Then we have A Close and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers, which is book 2 in that series, which I also did like. It's kind of linked to book one. You follow some similar characters, and I still did enjoy this one. Definitely worth it. A lot of people like that one better than book one. Then we have The Smell of the People's Houses, which at the time I enjoyed. I haven't talked about it since. I could not tell you that much about it. I know it's set in the North and just YA contemporary-ish. It was fine. We have Shatter Me, which extremely popular YA dystopian. Is it fantasy sci-fi? And this one, I felt a little alone at the time disliking it. I feel like nowadays it's very popular to hate on it, so I feel less alone, but I did not care for the writing style. A lot of it is like, is it a character's head or like is she writing? Anyway, a lot of it is in italics and like crossed. And I did not really care for it. And I think overall my issue is the fact that this feels like a prologue. Like you get to the ending, it's like, oh, this is what's going to start the story that people like. But I refuse to do that nowadays. I will not read 10 books before it gets better. I will not do that. But even at the time, I gave up after book one. It was just not for me. In a Dark, Dark Wood, at the time I liked it. Nowadays, I don't remember much except the main character running. It's a murder mystery, I think, right? It was fine. At the time I liked it, but I haven't talked about it since. The Outsiders, which is another book I had to read in high school, and I was curious to see how I would feel about it nowadays, and this is a classic for a reason. It's very readable, it's a YA book, everyone knows about it, I feel like, so it was good. And then we have The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, another YA book where you're following a gay main character. I listened to that one as an audiobook, which made it very readable. I enjoyed it at the time. I have not talked about it since. The best book I've read that month, I think I'm going to have to give it to A Closed and Common Orbit because Becky Chambers. It's definitely the one that stuck with me more. One of the things that's interesting is that you're following AI. I'm going to keep that vague because it is book 2, but that's one part that is really interesting. In August, I finished 8 books, and you're going to see why, because one of them is thick. The first one was The Last One, which it's one of those books that the premise is really interesting, but I feel like if I say it, it's almost a spoiler. But the main character goes into a reality TV show, but as she is there, she's trying to survive. That's basically what the TV show is about. It's survival. Things start being weird, so she decides to like walk back home and things stay weird. And I felt like the idea was better than the execution, but no hard feelings. It wasn't bad. Then I read Shadow and Bone, which is the first book in the Grisha trilogy. Everyone kept saying that the Six of Crow duology was great, and I wanted to read it, but I had heard that you needed to start with the trilogy, so I did that. And I know a lot of people say you can skip it, and I highly disagree, because you will not get all the explanation for the magic system, and as much as everyone is saying that you can skip, you can't. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but I wouldn't recommend it. At least read the first book. And I enjoyed it more than I feel like people do. For some reason, I've heard really negative things about the series, but I enjoyed it. At least book 1 was great. The TV show is now out, so I feel like everyone knows what it is about, but YA fantasy, main character who ends up discovering she has these magical powers, she's the chosen one, and it was good, okay? It was good. I liked it. I feel like sometimes when things become super popular, a lot of people like disliking them, and sometimes I really disagree. I think they're fantastic, or at least worth checking out. Then I read One of Us is Lying, and at the time I enjoyed it. I haven't talked about it since, but you have a main character that goes into detention, I guess. It's a YA contemporary. It was fine. I enjoyed it at the time, but like I said, I haven't thought about it since. Then we have Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, which, like, we know where this is going. 5-star. This is actually the book I personally recommend starting with by him instead of the Mistborn trilogy. It's 3 books. It's too much. Start with one standalone that will eventually become, I believe, a duology. The magic system is based on color. Super interesting. You have these 2 sisters that are princesses, and one of them was supposed to be sent to marry this god king, and the other one is sent. So the other sister goes to rescue her. And I liked that there is the trope of like God walking among us, but the gods are kind of strange. Let's just say that. The magic, like I said, was interesting. There's a talking sword in there. There's just some classic fantasy tropes, but in a really good way. The ending was fantastic, as always with him. And yeah, it's just a must read. I haven't read it, again, in 7 years. So my review is based on that. I do want to reread this eventually. It's also available for free as a PDF on his website, so that's why it's super accessible. Definitely recommend checking it out. Loved it at the time. I feel like I would like it too now, but who knows. Next, I had to put down Beer Town, which is not something that I did very often. I think this is the second one in this video I mentioned. This one I found it triggering, which doesn't happen to me often, but it is about grape. Think small town hockey players, and I just was not feeling it, so I put it down. It's super popular though, so Then I read I See You by Claire McIntosh, which at the time I gave 3-star to. There was something in there that I couldn't pinpoint what annoyed me, and nowadays I know. I know I can spoil it for you in the comment section as always, but there's a trope in here that I cannot stand, and it's is it murder mystery thriller? And yeah, nowadays I think I would give it a lower rating. I had given it 3 point something, but I don't know how I would rate it nowadays, probably lower. So the reason I had only read 8 books, which is the max I do nowadays, but at the time it's because I read It by Stephen King, which is what, like 1,300 pages. Stephen King can yap. This is great until the ending. I really enjoyed the way that he writes those young characters, their fears, they feel so real. Fear of the dark, fear of the bullies. He's a little too good, actually, at writing awful characters, like the fridge scene. No. But I had a lot of issues with that specific scene towards the end, which are you... Clearly that man was not okay at the time, and I also felt like the ending was super weak, which I have since found out that this is really a common issue with him in general. But yeah, I think checking out that book is worth it if you are intrigued, but just be prepared for the mess at the end. Then I read Harry Potter 6. So the best book, shockingly, will have to go to Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I'm really curious at this point if I'm going to have to give the best book of the year to him or if something else will get better. I don't know yet. In September, I also finished 8 books. The first one was a nonfiction called Stiff, The Curious Life of Human Cadavers, which kind of sounds a little dark. But the one thing that really stuck with me is the story of this woman, which I feel like it's been on the news. She gave her body to science, and then I think her son found out that she was used in, like, is it car crashes, or they made her body explode? Like... It's not funny, but like, oh my gosh. So that's the story that stuck with me the most. So if you are intrigued with like these kind of topics, I would recommend this author in general. I read We Are Okay, which I wanted to try to find one book that was a YA contemporary with a lesbian character, because I kept being recommended all the gay characters and I wanted to balance it out. And I'll be honest, it did not stick with me like at all, but it is about mental health and I think grief. But yeah, like I said, I haven't thought about this book since 2017. I feel like nowadays there are more books that are popular with lesbian characters, but I feel like at the time nobody was talking about them on Booktube. Sight is an interesting YA sci-fi. You can see I was still reading a ton of YA. I feel like I don't read that many nowadays, but this was popular and I do think this one was worth the hype. In this one, you're following a utopia. I feel like there was a lot of dystopian. This was a utopia. Not really, you'll see. But essentially, in that world, death is not a thing anymore. So in order to keep the population under control, you have these people that are sites that will go and end people's lives. And the main character becomes one, or he's in training and realizes that maybe things are not as perfect as they seem, and there's a little bit more political intrigue that he is expecting. So I did read the whole trilogy. Book 1 was definitely worth checking out. Then I read another nonfiction called Freakonomics, which at the time was super popular, and I read it and I found it just okay. And it has since been into, what's that podcast named? You know the one, and they bashed it, so I feel a little relieved, because at the time I thought it was okay. I thought it was also a bit repetitive for how short it was, but it made me feel a lot saner. Yeah, I felt a lot more sane, noticing that I wasn't the only one that felt weird about it, and I feel like they worded it so much better than I could have, at least at the time. So I don't remember all the details, I just remember feeling really underwhelmed compared to the hype. Goodreads is really playing with me, because there's a third book that is missing. So A Court of Wings and Ruin, which is book 3 in this series. So let me talk about book 2 and 3, because why not? Book 2 I did like. I felt like it felt more like a classic fantasy series. I felt like it explained my issues with book 1, specifically the romance. It became a bit more cringy than I would have liked with some of the spicy scenes, because how many more times can you just not hiss at people? What's the word? Like growl? It was cringe, but I understood the hype a lot more. I did feel like it was a bit too matchy-matchy, like trying to make every character find their mates. Anyway, but I understood the hype a lot more, and it was really readable, so I enjoyed the world and everything a lot more, and that's why I continued and read book 3. Which I thought was the last book in that series, in my defense, so that's why I really wanted to finish it, and then I realized it was not the last book, and it felt like, you know, the middle book syndrome where like nothing freaking happens? Yeah, nothing happens. They're just traveling and preparing for a battle that doesn't happen, and it was kind of boring, so I gave up on the series. So yeah, that wasn't for me, but book 2 was much better than book 1. Then I read The Long Walk, which I think is my favorite Stephen King book, even though it's written under a different name, and it doesn't really feel like a classic Stephen King book. But this one, it's a dystopian world where 100 boys are picked, or they can volunteer to go on this long walk where there will only be one last boy at the end that can wish for anything that they want, and everyone else, if they slow down or they stop, they get shot. Which at the time I wondered why they would choose to do that. I felt like there was a little bit of a lack of like world building there. I have since learned that this was inspired by real life events, so I feel like it explains a bit more. And once again, the ending kind of sucked, but overall it was horrifying as it should have been. So I liked it at the time. Then they both died at the end. I feel like this one has gotten a little bit of hype lately on Book Talk, and the title kind of spoils it for you, but it is a YA contemporary romance. Characters that you wish throughout the book that they will not die, but like that's literally the title and the premise of the book. So be prepared for the tears if you are more sensitive, I guess. But it was good at the time. I enjoyed it. And then I read Wool, which is a post-apocalyptic book. Again, I was finally starting to realize that this is my jam. And this one is divided in like 5 short stories in the first book, and I do think that the first 2 are really good, and then it kind of slows down a little bit, and I have yet to continue, although I do want to. I have also watched the first season TV show, which was good. Probably better than the book. But it starts with humanity, what's left of humanity in these giant silos, and people that misbehave or anything are sent outside to clean the windows, and you're following the story through investigation, and it was good. I think the best book for September will have to be The Long Walk by Stephen King. In October, I finished 10 books. The first one is Pines, which is a trilogy. I'm going to talk about the whole trilogy in one go. I think I've only read the first 2 in that specific month, but whatever. This is something that will be a hit or a miss for you, but this was right up my alley. It starts with this man who is sent to investigate the disappearance of other secret agent in this small town, and he gets there, things are weird. And I feel like that doesn't really give justice to the book, but it's kind of hard without spoiling it. I can tell you in the comment section what that other genre is in there, which is probably why it's hit or miss depending on how you feel about that subgenre. Personally, big fan. Kind of giving you a hint there. And I binge read this series super quickly. I really enjoyed it. I also watched a TV show, which I think the ending is even better than the book, although I found season 2 a bit weaker. In general, this author will write fantastic thrillers, like sci-fi thrillers that will keep you up at night. Like, you want to finish them, absolutely. They're fast read, they read like movies, so the prose is not super intense. I do feel like some of his weaknesses, like the characters, especially female characters, is kind of obvious in this series, but overall, it was definitely worth checking out. The next book I read was I Let You Go, which I think is my favorite by this author, although I can't tell you what it was about. I know I gave it 4 stars and enjoyed it, but it didn't stick with me. I feel like mystery thrillers, you kind of forget what they're about. At least I do. A lot more than like a fantasy book, for example. So at the time I liked it. I think it's my favorite by her. I read The Running Man by Stephen King, once again under Richard Bachman. This one reads very much like an action movie. Main character participates into this almost like reality TV show, a lot of pew pew, which is not in theory really my jam, but I did enjoy it at the time. Or Every Fear was my second book by Peter Swanson. This one was good. You're following a character who is basically stalking someone else. It's not my favorite book by him, but it wasn't bad. I then read Sleeping Beauties by Stephen King and Son, and it was just okay. It felt super long, but you're following this world where women are falling asleep, like they get sick and falling asleep in this cocoon, and men are just left alone on their own, dealing with the consequences, and like there's a lot to it. It does introduce you to one of my most hated characters of all time, so thank you, King. But the ending was just okay, as always. Behind Her Eyes was a fever dream. It's one of those books that I can't really recommend easily to people because in theory it's everything I hate, yet I could not put it down. So like it's completely unhinged. And I'm not even sure why I liked it, but I just did. You follow main character who is a single mom. She conveniently gets rid of her kid for, I don't know, a few months, the summer or something, and she is always drinking. And in your new job, she kind of ends up having some kind of affair with her boss, which like all of this I hate reading about. But then it becomes completely unhinged. I can't even tell you what it is about. It's just so intense, and the ending was crazy. And yeah, I gave it 4 stars. It happened. And yeah, I'm not going to justify it. I liked it. It is what it is. The Fireman was a dystopian book by Stephen King's son. I'm saying it like that because I don't think I'm going to read more book by him. Basically, people get this disease and they kind of just burn. It is what it is. At the time, I liked it, but I'm not sure I would if I were to reread it. It was just okay. Then I read The Unbecoming of Mary Dyer. I was still trying to read those popular YA books that used to be popular basically as I was starting or before I started doing Booktube. And this was such a mess, but like in a fun way. I feel like some books you hate read them because it's just so bad that it's fun ranting about it. This was it, like classic YA book where everyone is against the main character, and then she meets this really hot guy in school with an accent who turns out to be rich, and like her teacher, Spanish teacher's mean to her, and like the classic stuff, you know? So it was fun to hate, to be honest. I think this is my longest review ever on Goodreads, so did not like it, but it was fun to hate it. And then I read Little Fires Everywhere, which was, again, a book that became a TV show. I have not watched it. Is it worth it? This is contemporary mystery. I remember liking it quite a bit at the time. I liked the writing, and I don't remember the story. I haven't talked about it since, so it didn't stick with me, but I remember liking it. So if I have to choose a favorite here, I'm going to have to give it to the Pine series by Blake Crouch. Again, I've only technically read the first 2 books in that month, but I love that series. I don't know how I would feel about it if I were to reread it. Maybe one day I will. I'll probably hate the characters more this time around, but it was so readable. And I enjoyed the twist, so. In November, I only read 3 books, which is kind of shocking. The first one was Before I Fall, which is a YA book where the main character relives the last day of her life over and over again. Like I said, I like that trope, and it was okay. It's very like teenage girls drama kind of thing, but it becomes a bit more deep towards the end. So I enjoyed it for what it was, but it didn't become an all-time favorite. Then I read Pet Sematary by Stephen King. I think this is my favorite Stephen King that is like, it feels like a Stephen King book. This family moves into this new house and their pets die, and they find this pet cemetery where if you put your cat underground, I don't know how you word this in English, but if you do that, they can come back to life, and like, this was very creepy, and I did like the ending. So that's why I'm saying this is probably my favorite classic Stephen King book. And then I read La Belle Sauvage, which is a prequel to his Dark Material series, which is one of my all-time favorite series. Adult. I would categorize this as adult, okay? I know you can debate that, but adult fantasy series. I grew up reading it, absolutely loved it. And then the prequel finally arrived. This is set, I don't know, I think like 10 years before the series, and I was so excited for it, and this felt like a ridiculously long prologue that was really pointless. So I was super disappointed, which is probably why it took me the whole month to read it. It was not great. Definitely still recommend the actual series though. And then in December, I read 6 books. The first one was The Last Town, which is the last book in that trilogy by Blake Crouch, so we're just going to move on. Then I read a nonfiction called So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which I believe the author narrates the audiobook, so I would recommend it that way instead because he's like awkward in a likable way. And the book was okay. Like, I feel like the topic is more interesting than the actual book, but I feel like it's probably feeling dated nowadays because you're following people, it's nonfiction, so actual human people. I've been talking for too long. So you're following people that tweeted something really dumb and you're seeing the consequences of what happened, which I feel like nowadays we would have a lot more examples of that, but at the time it was like a huge deal. And nowadays I feel like it happens literally every day, but it was interesting at the time to read, so I overall enjoyed that one. Then I read Gemini. So I was telling you, Illuminate, the first book in that YA series, I read the physical book, and then I tried the audiobook for Gemini, which, oh my gosh, this was painful. Not only because you read the address email of everyone and the date constantly, but also listening to adults having these really cringy conversation of like between 2 teenagers, like romancy, was so bad. I got secondhand embarrassment so bad. So I never continued this series because I hated that. So the book wasn't awful, but I hated listening to it. Then I read book 2 and 3 in the Grisha trilogy that I was mentioning earlier. I understand why people were hating on some of the stuff that happens in book 3 mostly, but I overall enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun YA fantasy series to check out. So I would still recommend it, unpopular opinion. And then extremely unpopular opinion, but I read The Hobbit and I didn't like it. I know. I loved Lord of the Rings. Okay, I did, but I didn't care for The Hobbit. I think it's because I didn't grow up reading it. I feel like that's a big part of why people love it, but I struggled to read a physical book. I ended up trying to finish it through audiobooks, and there's a lot of songs, and it wasn't for me. I didn't even watch the movies. I just couldn't do it. So yeah, unpopular opinion. At the time, I felt bad admitting it. Nowadays, I don't care. I didn't care for it. It happens. It's okay. So if I have to choose a favorite, I think I would have to give it to The Last Town, the last book in that trilogy. So I know in the beginning I announced that the official number that I had finished that year was 116, but I believe we went through all of them and 3 of them were missing. So possibly 119. So the number 1 best book out of 119. Let's choose it. I feel like through the 12 that I've mentioned that were the best per month, it will not come as a shock that it has to be a Sanderson's book. Come on. I feel like 2017 Emily would 100% choose him as her favorite that year. So like, I feel the need to respect that in 2024. To be fair, looking back at these books, I think that would also still be my answer. And it would have to be in between Warbreaker and Hero of Ages. It's really hard though. I feel like I would need to reread them to be like 100% sure how I feel about them, but I think I'm going to give it to Hero of Ages. While I don't think it was the perfect book, nothing is really that perfect. I feel like you can always, say, oh, this was maybe the weakest part. And again, the religion part, I'm keeping it vague to not spoil everything, but I think this is the first time that my mind was completely blown. Again, I keep saying it that way, but it's the best way to explain it. When you realize that every piece of the world building, the magic system, the characters, everything falls and it just fits and it just makes sense. And I just remember sitting there when I was done and being like, oh my God, I don't think I've read that many authors that are able to do that. And he does it every time. It's just, at least with his adult fantasy. I have since again found out the YA stuff is more hit and miss, but officially my best book of 2017, the number 1 best book I read that year, will have to go to Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. Does it come as a surprise? Probably not. But I think that 2017 Emily and 2024 Emily would agree that this was just fantastic. So we have our second best book of all time in my list. So thumbs up if you are enjoying this series. Subscribe because I'm continuing to post those videos until the end of the year. We have 4, I believe, more books to do. Yeah, 4 more videos to post in this series. So I will link actually 2016 if you want to see it, and I can link 2022. You can also check out 2023. It's also out. I'll link the playlist. Let's just do that way. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thumbs up, subscribe like I was saying, and I will see you in the next video very soon. Bye. This is a lot of fun, but oh my gosh, was this long.